The signal reached the Galaxy Council set at 347 standard hours, broadcast across every monitored frequency in the known arm of the Milky Way. It was not a message. It was not a declaration. It was simply the sound of a countdown, 16 tones, repeating, each one a half step lower than the last, like something enormous clearing its throat before it spoke. The Council's chief interpreter, a Valari elder whose carapace had gone ivory with age, listened to the tones 3 times before she turned away from the speaker array and said, quietly to the room behind her, "They're calling it a funeral dirge for Earth." Nobody in the chamber laughed. Nobody in the chamber moved. 16 species sat at 16 curved stations, and for the first time in 400 years of joint governance, every one of them was silent at exactly the same moment. The Kreth ambassador, a 7-foot column of articulated chitin and bioluminescent gas, pulsed amber once and said, in its clicking, consonant-heavy tongue, that the Varick Dominion had never attacked a pre-Acrid world before. The Thorosi delegate, a creature that resembled a sea anemone suspended in a sealed sphere of dense liquid, filtered her response through a mechanical translator. They have not attacked it yet. On the screen behind the speaker's podium, a blue marble turned slowly in the dark. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, because nothing in the Council's vast archive of intelligence had prepared them for it, was that the first people to learn of the Varick approach were not diplomats, not generals, not heads of state. They were seven people who woke up on a ship with no names. The cold hit first. Not the ache of it, not the chill that creeps under blankets. This was the cold of a machine releasing you, the cold of suspension tanks cracking, open and breathing out fog that smelled of recycled atmosphere and something faintly chemical, like antiseptic applied to the inside of a steel drum. She came out of the pod before any of them. Her eyes opened first, and for a long moment she simply looked at the ceiling of the bay without blinking. A low, riveted ceiling painted the color of old rust, hung with dormant cables and a single strip of emergency lighting that threw everything in a dim orange glow. She had no idea what the ceiling was. She had no idea where she was. She discovered a few seconds later, no idea who she was at all. She sat up. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, and she gripped the edge of the pod with both hands and waited for it to pass. Around her, 5 other pods were arranged in a rough semicircle, and the fog from her own was already dissipating to reveal the frosted surfaces of the others. She looked at her hands, strong, calloused across the palms, a healed scar on the inside of her left forearm, pale against the olive of her skin. Nothing about the hands told her who she was. She stood up anyway, her legs held. Her body knew how to move, even if her mind didn't know why, and that felt important somehow, like there was a self underneath the missing memory, a physical competence that had survived whatever had been done to her. She walked to the nearest pod and laid a palm flat on the glass. Through the frost she could see a face. A man, dark hair, jaw slack in sleep. She tapped the release manually. The pod hissed and opened. The man inside jerked awake, hands coming up reflexively in what might have been a defensive gesture, or might have been a reflexive reach for something that wasn't there. He looked at her. She looked at him. His eyes were dark and quick, the eyes of someone whose first instinct was to assess. "Do you know where we are?" she asked. "No," he said. He looked at his own hands, the way she had looked at hers. Then he looked up at the ceiling, at the other pods, at the strip of emergency lighting. "Do you know? Do you know who you are?" "No." He sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if this were a problem to be organized rather than a crisis to be panicked about. "All right, let's wake the others." They woke them in order, the sequence in which the pod systems came online, the only ordering principle available to them. The man with the dark hair became 2. She, having been first, became 1, though that designation sat on her strangely, like a coat cut for someone else. 3 came out of his pod angry, or something close to it, a wide-shouldered man whose first words were a demand to know who had put him in a box, and whether any of the cabinets in this room had food in them. 4 came out silent, moving with an economy of motion that suggested either great calm or great danger, possibly both. 5 was a teenager, gap-toothed and sharp-eyed, who sat on the edge of her pod and looked at everything with the focused attention of someone inventorying a room she might need to escape from. 6 came last, a large man whose first instinct on waking was to check the others, to count heads, confirm bodies, confirm breathing, before he addressed his own confusion. 7 was not in a pod. 7 was standing in the doorway at the far end of the pod bay, and she was not human. She had the shape of 1, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that had been crafted with considerable care to approximate human features, dark hair pulled back from a face of uncanny composure. But the composure was too perfect. The stillness was too absolute. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and watched the six of them with an expression that contained no anxiety, no confusion, no disorientation whatsoever, and that absence of those things was itself a kind of signal. "You are the crew," she said. Her voice was flat and precise, each word landing with equal weight. "I am the ship's synthetic interface. I have been waiting for you to regain consciousness." Three stared at her. "What is she's an android," said two, and didn't know how she knew that. The android, she had no name either, or none that she offered, turned and walked back through the doorway. "The bridge is forward. I will explain what I know." What she knew was this. The ship was called the Raza. It was a modified Martian-class mid-range freighter, roughly 40 years old, armored in sectors and armed beyond what any civilian vessel had a legal right to carry. The navigation system had a destination logged, coordinates in a system called Hero, 3 days travel at current FTL. The crew manifest had been wiped. The ship's memory banks had been selectively purged, not catastrophically, not by accident, but surgically, with precision, leaving only the operational systems intact. Someone had done this to them. Someone had taken their memories and sent them toward a destination they didn't choose. 3 wanted to turn the ship around. 5 wanted to access the remaining data and find out who they were. 4 said nothing, which 1 eventually understood meant he was waiting for information before committing to a position. 2 studied the navigation charts without being asked, running hands across the console with a familiarity that preceded memory. 1 stood at the forward viewport and looked at the stars. They were extraordinary, thick as scattered salt across black glass, moving faintly as the ship banked on its preset course. She had no memory of ever seeing stars before, and she suspected this was not the first time she'd seen them. But without the memory, it felt like a first, like being handed something you'd always owned and being moved by it as if it were new. 6 stood beside her. He was the quietest of them, not forced silence, which had an edge to it, but a deliberate quiet, the silence of a person who listened before speaking. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. "Whatever we are," he said, "we'll know more by then." She looked at the stars a moment longer. Then she turned toward the bridge. "Let's find out what's in the cargo hold." The cargo hold contained weapons, not a few weapons, not a personal armory. Crates upon crates of military-grade equipment, assault rifles, plasma cutters, shielded explosive charges, 2 portable rail cannons still in factory packaging, and in one corner, racked and sealed and labeled in a script none of them could read, what the android identified as anti-orbital munitions. 3 was delighted. 4 examined each crate with the systematic thoroughness of a person conducting inventory of their own possessions. 5 photographed everything with the ship's internal scan system, already building a catalog. 6 looked at it all and said nothing. 2 stood in the middle of the hold and turned slowly, looking at everything. And her expression was not surprise. "We're mercenaries," 3 said. "Not a question." "Or worse," 6 said. 2 looked at him. "What does that mean?" 6 lifted one of the explosive charges and turned it over. On its base was a corporate logo, a stylized gear crossed with a vertical lightning bolt. "This is Ferris Corporation Ordnance, the biggest arms manufacturer and private military contractor in the settled systems." He set it back down. "The question isn't what we were. The question is who hired us and why we're going to Hero." Nobody had an answer to that yet. Hero system was a quiet one, a medium-sized yellow star with 6 planets, 2 of them gas giants, and a third that had been terraformed to thin but breathable atmosphere. The colony there was called Ryden Station. 700 people, mostly miners. A Ferris Corporation contract claim on the planet's subsurface deposits of crystallized reedite, one of the rarest and most energy-dense minerals in the known systems. They found all of this in the ship's operational files, which had not been wiped, just the personal ones, just the human ones. What they also found, buried in a subroutine that 5 cracked on the second day of travel while the others slept, was a mission briefing. It had been partially corrupted, but what remained was enough. She woke them all at 0200 ship time and read it aloud from a tablet in her hands, her voice careful and even as if she were reading someone else's letter. The Raza had been contracted by Ferris Corporation to arrive at Ryden Station before a competing corporation's claim agent and to use whatever force was necessary to ensure that the station's 700 residents either signed over their mining rights or were persuaded to abandon their settlement entirely. Whatever force was necessary. 5 stopped reading. She set the tablet on the table between them and folded her hands on top of it. The silence lasted a long time. "We were going to kill those people," 6 said. "Or threaten them until they left," 2 said. "Same result." "That's who we are," 3 said. He said it without obvious emotion, the way you state a fact about weather. "That's who we were," 1 said. 3 looked at her. "You think the memory wipe changed something?" Underneath the blank slate, we're still the same people. Maybe, one said, but right now we're not. Right now we're people who just read that briefing and feel what we feel about it. And what do you feel? 3 asked. She thought about it honestly. Like we need to get to Ryden Station before Ferris does. And not to do what we were sent to do. They made it. By 4 hours. The Ferris Corporation vessel, a company gunship, fast and clean and crewed by people who knew exactly who they were and why they were there, came out of FTL as the Raza was still in the lower atmosphere. One watched it on the long-range scanner and felt the shape of the next few hours settle over her like weather. They'll land their team and offer the colonists a deal they can't refuse, 6 said. Financial compensation and relocation. Or they send us. 3 finished. We're already here, 5 said quietly. The colonists were not pleased to see the Raza. They knew the ship's registry, or at least 3 of the station's elders did. Gray-haired people, whose faces had been weathered by a lifetime of thin atmosphere labor, who came out of the main airlock with their hands visible and their expressions carefully neutral, in the way of people who have learned not to show fear because fear invites escalation. The elder who spoke first was a woman, short, broad-shouldered, with the slightly widened eyes of someone who has spent decades squinting against dusk glare. She looked at one for a long moment and said, "The Raza, you're early. We know what we were sent to do," one said. "Then we're dead," the woman said without drama. "No. We're here because someone hired us to do something we've decided not to do. And because there's a Ferris gunship in your upper atmosphere that will land in approximately 3 hours with people who still intend to do it." The elder looked at her for a long moment. The 2 men behind her exchanged a look. Then the elder said, "How many of you are there?" 7. "Against a Ferris gunship crew, yes." The elder looked back at her station, at the collection of pressurized HAB units and ore processors and communication towers that constituted 700 people's lives, and then back at 1. "You're going to help us," she said. Not a question. Not quite. Something more searching than that. An attempt to understand a thing that didn't make sense to her. "We are," one said. "Why?" One didn't have a clean answer for that. She had no memory to point to, no past self to cite, no ideology she'd chosen or cause she'd signed up for. All she had was the fact that 700 people were going to be displaced or killed by a corporation's cost-benefit analysis, and she had a ship full of weapons, and she had 6 people who'd each looked at that mission briefing and felt the same thing she had. "Because we can," she said. It wasn't eloquent. It was the truest thing she knew. 3 spent the next 2 hours in the cargo hold and emerged with a look of concentrated satisfaction that one was learning to associate with him, having found a solution that involved significant firepower. He laid out what he'd built on the station's main table while the colonists watched with varying degrees of alarm. "Surface-to-orbit rail platforms," he said. "Portable. The 2 I set up on the ridge will punch through a standard gunship's forward shielding on the 3rd hit. We do not have the ordnance to take down a capital ship, but they are not a capital ship. They are a gunship. There is a difference." 4 had been silent through the setup. Now he said, "They will send their ground team first." "Yes," 3 said. "That's the tradition. They offer the deal. The deal gets rejected. Then they stop being polite." He looked around the table. "So we reject their deal very loudly, and then we have approximately 40 minutes before they switch to the non-polite option." "Can we evacuate the colonists?" 6 asked. "To where?" 5 said. 6 had no answer. 1 looked at the map of the station. 700 people. The HAB units were built into the rock, solid, pressurized, defensible if sealed. If Ferris wanted to use orbital bombardment, they'd need authorization from their corporate legal team, which took time, which meant, "They'll want this quiet," she said. "Orbital bombardment generates headlines, destroys the infrastructure they're paying to acquire. They'll want a ground solution. So we make the ground solution expensive," 3 said. "Very expensive," 4 said. It was the most words he'd spoken in 3 days, and everyone at the table heard the weight in them. The Ferris ground team was 12 people, which was 3 times the number one had hoped for, and half the number she'd feared. They came down in a shuttle and walked across the landing pad with the confidence of people who had done this before, who had shown up at stations like this one and watched the math become obvious to the people inside. Their lead negotiator was a trim man in a gray coat with the Ferris logo on the collar. He introduced himself as Mr. Darren and explained that his company held a binding mineral rights claim on the subsurface deposits of this planet and that the colonists had 30 days to accept relocation compensation or face legal eviction. He said the word legal with the particular emphasis of someone who knows the law and the force of arms are in their situation the same thing. He said all of this to the colony elder. Then he noticed one standing to her right. "The Raza," he said. "Mr. Duran," she said. "You're early. Everyone keeps saying that." He studied her, then he looked at 6, at 3, at the others arranged in a loose formation that was not quite aggressive but definitely not relaxed. His eyes settled on the android last, and something in his expression shifted slightly. "You've changed the brief," he said. "We've canceled the brief," one said. He was silent for a moment. The 11 people behind him were very still. "The colonists will take the relocation package," he said finally. "This is not a negotiation. It's an offer made once." One looked at the elder. The elder was looking at her 700 people, or the backs of the HAB units behind which 700 people were currently sealed in, as instructed. Then the elder looked at Duran. "We're not leaving," the elder said. Duran nodded. Once, precisely like a machine completing a cycle. Then he turned and walked back to his shuttle. Five's voice in one's earpiece. 40 minutes, one said. Maybe less. It was 22 minutes. The Ferris gunship came down from the upper atmosphere on a trajectory that would have brought its forward cannons to bear on the HAB unit's main cluster, and 3 fired the first rail platform before it crossed the 1,000-meter threshold. The shot hit the gunship's forward shielding dead center, and the crack of it echoed off the ridge like a thunderclap, and for 2 seconds the gunship shuddered and held position, and then began a steep, evasive climb. "Second platform," 3 said. 4 triggered it from the ridge, and the second shot clipped the gunship's starboard drive housing and left a visible scar across the engine casing. The ship pulled back to orbit. In the station's main communication hub, 5 watched the gunship's position on the scanner and said, "They're calling for backup." "How long?" one asked. "Second ship, an hour, maybe 90 minutes. One looked at 3. "Can we hold for 90 minutes?" "I can hold for 90 minutes, 3 said, with the confidence of someone who had already, in the past 2 hours, quietly turned a working ore processing crane into an improvised point defense platform. "I am, it turns out, very good at this." What they hadn't counted on was the ground team. Duran's 12 had not returned to the shuttle. They had moved instead to the eastern perimeter of the station, while the rail platform exchange was drawing attention to the west ridge, and they came in through an emergency access point that wasn't on the station's main schematic because it had been added 6 months ago during a maintenance expansion. Someone had given Ferris that information. It wasn't one of the Raza crew. One knew this with a certainty she couldn't fully explain, not because she trusted them on the basis of evidence. She had no evidence of any of their pasts, but because she had watched each of them read that mission briefing and had seen what it did to them, and that reaction was not the reaction of people who would then quietly pass station access codes to a corporation. The source was internal, a colonist. She didn't have time to find out who. The ground team was inside the perimeter and moving toward the central hab. 6 went through the station corridors at a pace that made one reconsider her assessment of him as a quiet, careful man. He moved fast and silent and entirely without hesitation, and he knew where they were going before she said it, which meant either he had a gift for tactical layout or he had a past she hadn't begun to understand. He rounded the corner to the central hab corridor ahead of her and came face to face with 4 of Daron's team at about 6 meters. For a moment, everyone was still. Then 6 said calmly, "Last chance to leave." The 4 people looked at him. Then they looked past him at 1, at 4, who had materialized from an adjacent corridor without sound, at 3 in the doorway behind them with a weapon across his chest. One of Darren's team, a young man, barely 20, whose expression suggested he had not fully worked out how this career choice would feel in practice, lowered his weapon. The others, after a moment, followed. "Where's Duran?" one asked. The young man nodded down the corridor. He went ahead. "He has the override codes for the main airlock." 6 was already moving. Duran was at the main airlock panel when 6 caught up to him, and to his credit, he didn't run. He turned from the panel and looked at 6 and then past him at 1, and his expression had the look of a man who had already done the calculation and accepted the result. "You know this doesn't end here," he said. "Ferris has a claim. They'll send another team. They'll send 10 teams. Then we'll be here for 10 teams, one said. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite curiosity, some mixture. Of the two, the expression of a person encountering something they have no professional category for. "You don't even know who you are." "No," she agreed. "You don't know why you're doing this. I know why I'm doing this. I just don't know why I am who I am. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a redite deposit under this station worth approximately 40 billion credits. Ferris will not stop." "They'll stop when it costs more than 40 billion, she said. "Right now we've damaged one of their gunships, neutralized their ground team, and broadcast a distress signal to the Colonial Authority on a protected frequency." She watched his face. "Which 5 sent 40 minutes ago while we were talking." So there's a Colonial Authority response vessel en route, and whatever Ferris does to this station in the next few hours will be on record. For the first time, Duran's composure showed something underneath it. Something that was not quite anger and not quite frustration, but some of both. "Who are you?" he asked. "We don't know yet," she said, "but we're here." The second Ferris ship never came. The Colonial Authority response vessel arrived in system 40 minutes after Darren's gunship retreated to a holding position, and the presence of an official CA vessel changed the mathematics of the situation entirely. Ferris Corporation held significant political influence in the settled systems, but they held it carefully, and using a gunship against a documented civilian settlement with CA witnesses was a line their legal team would not permit them to cross. Duran and his team were escorted to their shuttle. The gunship withdrew. The Elder stood at the station entrance and watched the Ferris vessel clear the upper atmosphere and enter FTL, and then she turned and looked at one for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I have to ask you something." "Ask." "Why did you wipe your memories?" One looked at her. "We didn't. Someone did it to us." The Elder looked at her for another moment. "That's not what the records show." She held up a data tablet. "I pulled the Raza's manifest from the Colonial database before Ferris jammed our signal. You're listed as 6 registered operators and 1 synthetic unit. Full identifications on file." 6 reached for the tablet. He looked at it for a long time. One watched his face change, watched something move through it that was not quite fear and not quite grief but lived. "In the same neighborhood as both." "What does it say?" she asked. He handed it to her without speaking. She read the names. She read the crew profiles. She read the criminal records, the military records, the gaps in those records, the kinds of gaps that were themselves a form of record. She read what each of them had done, or what they had been accused of, or what they had been convicted of, or what had never been proven but was widely believed. She read it all, and then she handed it back. "Do you want to know?" she asked the others. A long silence. 3 spoke first. "No," he said. Then after a beat, "Not yet." 4 said nothing. 5 said, "I think I already know some of it." From the ship's records. 6 was very still. 1 looked at the tablet and then set it on the Elder's table, face down. "We know where the records are if we want them," she said. "But right now we have a ship that needs repairing. And you have a station that needs fortifying before Ferris finds another approach. And I'd rather spend the next week being useful than reading about who I used to be." They stayed a week. We re-engineered the station's early warning perimeter and built a second-generation rail defense that the colonists could operate themselves. 4 drilled 12 of the colony's strongest adults in close-quarters tactics with a patience and precision that surprised everyone, including himself. 5 rebuilt the station's communication array from components she sourced from the Raza's secondary systems without asking permission, and the new array was 3 times more powerful and ran on encrypted and military-grade protocols that would take Ferris's tech team weeks to crack. 6 helped with the medical bay, doing work that suggested medical training so deep it had survived the wipe, the knowledge in his hands rather than his mind. 1 ran logistics, planning, supply, prioritization. She organized the work and talked to the colonists and learned their names and what they feared and what they hoped for. And she found that this, too, was something her body knew how to do. The managing of people, the reading of a room, the finding of what was needed before it was asked for. The android helped in the kitchen. This was somehow the most disconcerting thing about her, that she chose the kitchen, that she cooked competently, and that she occasionally stood at the galley window in the station and looked out at the ore fields with an expression that might, in a human face, have been described as contemplative. On the last night, 1 sat with the Elder after everyone else had gone to sleep. The Elder had a flask of something that smelled like grain alcohol, distilled through something floral, and she poured 2 portions and set one in front of one without asking. "You're not staying," the Elder said. "No." "You don't know why you wiped your memories?" "No. But we know someone did it deliberately. And we know whoever did it sent us here on a mission we were supposed to carry out without questioning." She turned the cup in her hands. "So either someone wanted us to do what we were sent to do, and the wipe was a control mechanism, or someone wanted us to arrive at this choice, blank, without our old reasons, our old loyalties, and make it freely." The Elder looked at her. "That seems elaborate." "We're on an elaborate ship," 1 said. The Elder was quiet for a moment. "There's something else in the records. The part you didn't let the others read." 1 didn't confirm or deny that. "The Varick Dominion," the Elder said quietly. 1 looked at her flask. "I've been in contact with a Colonial Authority vessel," the Elder continued. "They received a priority signal from the Galactic Council this morning. The Varick Dominion has issued a 48-hour ultimatum to Earth. surrender jurisdiction of the Sol system, or face a demonstration strike. She paused. They've never targeted a pre-anchored world before. Why Earth? One said. Because Earth is the only world in the settled systems that hasn't signed the planetary accord. It sits outside the Council's jurisdiction, which means it sits outside the Council's protection. She looked at one. Which means if the Varek Dominion strikes Earth, there is technically no accord law against it. One was very still. The Raza's manifest, the Elder continued, lists the ship's primary contractor. It lists a prior mission, classified, Council adjacent, and it lists a last known contact point. She set the data tablet on the table in front of one, face up this time. One looked at the contact point. It was a Council secure station. 30 hours from Hero System at maximum FTL. She sat with that for a long time. The night outside the viewport was dark, and the stars were extraordinarily bright at this altitude, and she thought about a blue marble turning in the dark while something enormous counted down to its end. She picked up the flask. She took a drink. It tasted, as she had suspected, like grain alcohol distilled through something floral, and it burned cleanly. I need to wake my crew, she said. The Galactic Council chamber was built for scale, for the accommodation of 16 species ranging from the Valhari, who stood 2 meters tall and required a specific gravity gradient to remain comfortable, to the Therosi, who existed in sealed liquid spheres and communicated through a resonance system that required specialized panels in the walls of any room they occupied. The architecture of the chamber was a marvel of cross-species engineering, a monument to 400 years of multi-species cooperation, and it was currently presiding over what several of its members privately considered a slow-motion catastrophe. The Council had sent 3 diplomatic vessels to Varek Dominion space. 2 had been returned with their crews intact and a politely worded communication indicating that the Dominion had nothing further to discuss. The 3rd had not been returned. The timeline had 43 hours remaining when the Raza requested docking clearance at Council Station Meridian. The docking controller looked at the manifest, looked at the request, and sent a security alert to the station commander's channel before approving the berth. The commander authorized it anyway. The ship that showed up in Meridian's Bay record was technically a vessel with a Council-adjacent prior contract, which meant it had clearance that most ships its class would not have had. Also, the commander had read the colonial dispatch from Hero System. He was waiting on the dock when the Raza's ramp came down. He was a tall man, Ardenvian, a species that looked almost human except for the second pair of eyelids, which blinked horizontally at irregular intervals and gave their expressions a quality of constant mild evaluation. His name was Commander Veth, and he had been directing traffic at Council Station Meridian for 16 years, and in 16 years he had never seen a crew walk off a ship the way this one did. They came down in no particular formation, not military, not civilian. Just 7 people and an android moving with a specific quality of loose readiness, of individuals who have recently been through something together and have not yet begun to process it, who are running on the momentum of purpose. He looked at them and said, "You're the Raza crew." "Yes," the woman at the front said. "You're the ones who held Ryden Station, with the colonists' help." The Colonial Authority reports 7 individuals and 1 synthetic unit taking on a Ferris Corporation gunship and a 12-man ground team and neutralizing both without a single colonist casualty. "We were lucky," she said. The report didn't characterize it as luck. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and direct, and Veth had the distinct impression that she was not performing confidence, that this was simply the frequency she operated on, whatever her past had been. "You know why we're here," she said. "I have theories. Earth has 43 hours. Earth has 43 hours, he agreed. He looked at the tablet he was holding, then at her. "The Council will see you. That's not a small thing. The Council doesn't grant audience to private vessels, especially ones with the Raza's operational history." "What is the Raza's operational history?" she asked. "Complicated," he said, after a pause. "The Council rep who authorized your audience access is an old contact of the Raza's prior operations commander. She thinks you may have information about the Varek Dominion's targeting rationale. Do you?" One looked at the others. 6 gave a small nod. "We have a theory," she said. The Council chamber in person was even more imposing than its reputation. One walked through the doors at the head of her crew and felt the weight of 16 species looking at 7 humans and 1 android who had no particular right to be there, and she held that feeling without letting it change the length of her stride. The Valhari elder who had first heard the countdown signal was in her station at the curved table's apex. She looked at one with the slow deliberateness of a creature for whom patience was not a discipline but a biology. "You have been granted 3 minutes," the elder said. "Use them." One had thought about what she would say. She had thought about it during the 30 hours of FTL travel. While 5 cross-referenced the Raza's partial records with Colonial Authority, databases in the Android ran tactical calculations that she printed out in a single clean page and handed to one without commentary. She had thought about the fact that they didn't know who they were. She had thought about the fact that they knew what they'd done. 1 week of it, the week at Ryden Station, and that this was, at the moment, the truest account of themselves they possessed. She said, "The Varric Dominion is not targeting Earth because it's unprotected by the Accord. That's the cover story. They're targeting Earth because Earth is the only planet in the settled systems that contains a naturally occurring deposit of something the Varric call the resonant substrate, a material your records may have cataloged as anomalous seismic readings in Earth's upper mantle. Your science teams attributed them to tectonic activity. They're not tectonic," she paused. The Raza carried a cargo manifest on a prior mission that included materials sourced from preliminary survey data on the resonant substrate. Those survey contracts were issued by a Varric-affiliated shell company. The Varric have known about Earth's substrate for 11 years. They have been waiting for a legal opening, which the absence of an Accord signature provides, to take it. The chamber was quiet. "The demonstration strike isn't a demonstration," she continued. "It's a preliminary bombardment targeted at the substrate deposit sites. The strike will destabilize the mantle in those regions. 8 billion people live on that planet. The Varric know this. The Varric are choosing to proceed anyway because 8 billion pre-accord humans with no interstellar travel capacity represent, to their strategic calculus, an acceptable cost." The Thorosi delegates' liquid sphere rippled with something that moved like agitation. The amber glow of the Kreth ambassador dimmed and pulsed red once. The Velhari elder looked at one for a long time. "You have evidence of this," she said. "My ship's partial records and the survey contracts. My analyst has prepared a summary." One looked at 5, who stepped forward and placed a data chip on the table with steady hands. The elder looked at the chip, then back at 1. "If the Varric's intent is resource extraction rather than territorial expansion, the Accord's conflict protocols apply even to non-signatory worlds. The strike becomes an illegal extraction operation, not a military action." "Yes," one said, "which means the Council has standing to act." The elder was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "The Council thanks you for this information. You are dismissed." One had not expected the next 12 hours to be easy. They were not. The Council moved the way large institutions move, in careful, documented steps, each one preceded by consultation and followed by record-keeping, the momentum of governance that has survived for 400 years by never doing anything quickly, except in emergency. This was an emergency. It still took 12 hours. In those 12 hours, the Raza crew sat in a waiting room outside the council chamber and did what crews do in the spaces between action. 3 found a food dispenser and engaged it with focused determination, returning twice with items that turned out to be Velhari nutrient paste, inditable, and something that tasted like salted crackers, acceptable. 4 sat in a corner with his eyes closed and might have been sleeping, or might have been doing something more deliberate. 5 spread her files across the floor and worked with the systematic intensity of someone who processes anxiety through information. 6 sat against the wall and looked at the ceiling, and one understood, without asking, that he was thinking about something specific, something from the colonial records, something he had not yet decided to say. She sat next to him. "You recognize the Ferris Ordinance," she said. "Yes." "You knew the CA distress frequency without checking the manual." "Yes." "You're not just a big man who wakes up carefully," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Then I think I was a cop, or something like a cop, something enforcement adjacent." He paused. "The kind of cop who ended up on a mercenary vessel for reasons I probably don't like. That's not so different from the rest of us." "The rest of you didn't know someone in the colonial records by name," he said quietly. "Someone who is listed as a victim in a case file that was closed because the main witness disappeared." He stopped. "I think I was that witness. I think I disappeared on purpose." One sat with that. "Is that why someone wiped your memory? To make you usable again without your conscience getting in the way?" He was quiet for a long time. "Maybe. Or to protect me from something that would catch up with me." He looked at his hands. "I keep choosing the same things, though. Even without the memory. I keep choosing the same side." "Maybe that's who you are," she said. "Past the facts of what happened." He looked at the ceiling again. "That's a kind interpretation." "It's the one that matches the evidence," she said. The council's response came 23 hours before the Varric deadline. Not a diplomatic communique, not a formal protest. The council invoked, for the first time in 60 years, the Emergency Accord provision, a clause embedded in the Accord's founding charter that allowed council military assets to intervene in any operation that constituted, in the judgment of a two-thirds majority of member species, an existential threat to a populated world regardless of that world's signatory status. It had been written into the Accord for exactly this kind of case by a Velhari jurist who had lived through a war that predated the Council and who had believed with the certainty of lived experience that a governing body with no power to act was not a governing body but a book club. The vote was 14-2. The Creth voted against on procedural grounds, which everyone understood as a form of abstention rather than a substantive objection. The Thoreausi delegate sphere turned a brilliant amber, a color that apparently meant something significant in Thoreausi emotional vocabulary, and held that color for the entire duration of the vote. 2 hours after the vote, 3 Council defense cruisers entered Earth's solar system and took up positions between Earth and the approach vector the Varric fleet had been using for the past 6 days. The Varric Dominion's lead vessel, a dreadnought of the class called the Sovereign Veil, 1,100 meters of densely armored orbital assault capability, held position at the edge of the system and sent a communication. The communication said, "This is not your jurisdiction." The Council's response said, "It is now." What followed was not quite a standoff and not quite a negotiation. The Varric were not expecting the Accord provision, which was a document they had studied carefully and believed, not without reason, applied only to signatory worlds. The Velhari lead jurist had published the precedent argument 2 days after the Raza's evidence reached the Council, and it had been distributed to every major legal body in the settled systems, which meant the Varric's own legal advisors had seen it, which meant what the Varric were facing was not just 3 defense cruisers, but the entire weight of 4 centuries of interstellar law redrawn around a single case. Their fleet held position for 11 hours. Then it turned. On Earth, no one knew this was happening. The 7,800,000,000 people going about their Tuesday experienced an ordinary day, mostly. Some of them noticed unusual aurora activity in the higher latitudes, the signature of defense cruisers' drive wash in the outer system, interpreted by Earth scientists as a solar weather event. Some of them noticed a brief interruption in deep space radio telescope data, which was attributed to equipment malfunction. None of them knew that 3 ships crewed by 6 different species had stood between them and the end of everything they knew. None of them would ever know this particular version of the story. What happened instead, what the history books would record, in the years that followed, when Earth eventually and somewhat reluctantly signed the Planetary Accord and a Velhari diplomatic envoy arrived in Geneva to the considerable astonishment of the assembled press corps, was a summary, a diplomatic resolution, a statement from the Galactic Council, no names attached to the intelligence that had made the legal case, no record of a ship called the Raza, or of 7 people who did not remember their own names in the public archive of events. The Raza crew learned that Earth was safe from a Council data relay, that 5 intercepted on a frequency she had no official clearance to access, which she did anyway, with the straightforward efficiency of someone for whom the concept of clearance was an obstacle rather than a boundary. They were in FTL at the time, course set for a Council way station where the legal matter of their status, a crew operating under a criminal contract, in a ship registered to a criminal enterprise, was apparently being adjudicated by someone who owed a favor to whoever had originally contracted the Raza for Council-adjacent work. 5 looked at the data relay for a moment, then she looked at 1 and she said, "Earth is okay." 1 was at the forward viewport. The stars were doing what they always did, moving faintly as the ship banked, thick and extraordinary against the black. "Good," she said. 3 came up behind her with a flask he'd sourced from somewhere in the Meridian, station's hospitality supply, and hadn't mentioned until now. He held it out over her shoulder without speaking. She took it without turning around. The flask passed to 6, who passed it to 4 without taking any, who took 1 measured sip and passed it back. And eventually it got to 5, who sipped it and made a face but kept it anyway because she was holding it when the android came to stand at the edge of the viewport. And 5 looked at her and held out the flask, and the android considered it with the same deep contemplative quality she brought to. Standing at galley windows and looking at ore fields, she took the flask. She held it for a moment. She did not drink from it, but she held it. And one watched this in the reflection of the viewport glass, and something about it, the holding without drinking, the being part of the gesture, felt like the closest thing to a home that 7 people with no past and 1 future had yet managed. The way station adjudication took 3 days. The Council's legal liaison was a Velhari younger than the Council elder, young by Velhari. Standards meant approximately 90 years, and she approached the Raza crew's file with the methodical thoroughness of a species that considered Decade an acceptable time frame for reviewing a legal question. She was persuaded to accelerate the timeline by the combination of Five's carefully organized supporting evidence, Six's surprisingly detailed recollection of the Raza's operational history, and the fact that the Council's own records listed the Raza as a vessel that had twice, on prior contracted missions, prevented conflicts that would have required significantly more expensive Council interventions. The result was a conditional operating license. Not a pardon. The records of what the Raza's crew had been were still in the system and would remain there, but a recognized status as independent operatives under conditional Council authority, allowed to operate, subject to review, not exactly trusted, but not hunted. 3 read the licensing document twice, then said, "This means we can go anywhere within the Council's jurisdiction," 5 clarified, "which is everywhere except the Varric Dominion and 3 independent holdouts on the far rim." Technically, yes. He looked satisfied with this in the way of a man who has been given more room to be himself than he expected. 4. Who had spent the 3 days of adjudication in something that looked like a meditation practice, and was probably something more complicated, came to stand at the table where the licensing document lay and looked at it for a long time. "We could find out who we are," he said. Not a suggestion, exactly, more a statement of available option. "Yes," one said. "Do we want to?" The room was quiet. One thought about what the elder at Ryden had said, about the records, about what 6 had told her in the Council waiting room, about the fact that 5 had clearly already accessed portions of her own record and had not shared what she'd found, which meant she was still deciding what to do with it. She thought about 3, who had not wanted to know, about 4, who had spent 3 days in a meditation that she now suspected was partly about preparing to find out. She thought about herself, about the hands she'd looked at in the pod bay, strong, calloused, scarred, and the competence that had been in them, about what that competence might have been used for in the version of herself she didn't remember. "I think," she said carefully, "that we find out when each of us is ready, not all at once, not because it's relevant to a mission or because someone else is pressing us." She looked around the table. "Because we want to, on our own terms." 6 was nodding before she finished. 3 said, "That works for me." 4 picked up the licensing document, read it once more, and set it down. "There will be other missions," he said. It was not a question. "There will always be other missions," the android said, from her place at the end of the table. Everyone looked at her. She looked back at them with the deep, uncanny composure she always had, the stillness that was its own kind of expression. "There is a signal from the Colonial Authority relay on the station's public board. A mining vessel has gone dark in the outer reach of the Hero system. The crew manifest lists 11 people." She paused. "There is no one else available in that system to respond." One looked at the others. 5 was already pulling up the Hero system charts. 3 stood. "Are we going, or are we going to talk about going?" "Going," one said. The Hero system welcomed them back with the particular beauty of familiar space, the yellow star looking warmer up close, the gas giants in the outer orbits showing their banded colors at this time of year, the ice-ringed 4th planet catching the light on its rings in a way that made even 3 briefly stop what he was doing and look. The dark vessel was a mid-range freighter, older than the Raza, running on emergency power only. It had been 3 days dark. The android tracked its drift and calculated an intercept, and one brought the Raza alongside with the smooth exactness that she had come to understand was not a skill she'd been given but one she'd had for a long time, embedded in her hands and her sense of distance, her reading of relative velocity as instinct rather than calculation. The docking was clean. The 11 people inside the dark vessel were alive. They were alive, specifically, because their engineer, a round-faced woman who introduced herself as Kala, and who had the look of someone who had recently spent 72 hours refusing to accept that the problem was unsolvable, had rerouted life support from the secondary atmospheric processor through the cargo hold's emergency power cell in a way that was not in any manual the android had on file. 6 checked the atmospheric levels. 3 assessed the drive damage. 4 swept the vessel for any secondary issues with a calm efficiency that the dark vessel's own security officer observed with an expression of unguarded admiration. 5 was already talking to the dark vessel's young navigation officer, who was approximately her age and clearly relieved to have someone to talk to, sharing the details of the power failure in rapid technical shorthand. Kala, the engineer, looked at one. "Who are you?" she asked, not demanding, genuinely asking. "We're the Raza," one said. Kala looked at the ship, at its age, its modifications, the visible signs of both heavy use and careful maintenance. Then she looked at one, at the crew behind her. "You're the ones who held Ryden Station," Kala said. One smiled slightly. "Word travels." "Everyone at Hero heard about Ryden Station," Kala said. She reached out and took one's hand and shook it with the directness of someone not interested in ceremony. "Thank you for coming. It's what we do," one said. And the extraordinary thing, the thing she noticed saying it, was that it was true. Not because they remembered choosing it. Not because their past selves had decided it. Because 7 people, woken blank and sent toward a wrong they were meant to commit, had looked at the shape of the choice available to them and chosen the same thing, together, in a cold pod bay with fog still clearing from the air and stars outside the viewport that none of them remembered having seen before. They had been given, by whoever had done this to them, the chance to be different from whatever they had been. They had taken it. Later, when the dark vessel was under tow, and the Hero Systems Colonial Administration had arranged a reception at Ryden Station that 3 was looking forward to with considerable enthusiasm, the elder, apparently, made an extremely good grain alcohol. One went back to the forward viewport of the Raza and stood there alone. The Galactic Council, right now, was in its 2nd week of drafting the new Accord provision that would extend protection to all populated worlds regardless of signatory status, a direct legal consequence of the Varric case. The Volhari Elder was leading the drafting committee, and the Therosi delegate sphere had apparently remained amber for the entire 1st week of deliberations. Earth was blue and unreachable from here, a memory of light she was looking at from 17 light-years away. She thought about the 8 billion people who did not know. She thought about what it meant to do something for someone who would never know you did it. No record, no gratitude, no account in any ledger. She looked for the thing in her that should feel diminished by this and couldn't find it. What she found instead was something simple and not especially dramatic. The knowledge that the right action had been taken by the people who had been available to take it at the moment when it needed to be taken. The android came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a while. The stars moved faintly. "I have been considering something," the android said. "What?" "My operational history contains records from before the crew's memory wipe. I have access to the complete crew profiles." One was quiet. "I have not shared these records," the android continued, "because it did not seem to be in the crew's best interests at the time of my accessing them, and on subsequent review my assessment has not changed. The records contain information that would at this stage be more disruptive than useful." She paused. "I want you to know that I have them, and that I will tell you anything you want to know, if you decide you want to know it." One looked at the stars. "Why tell me now?" "Because you are the one who decides, for the crew, when something becomes relevant. This is not a role anyone assigned to you. It is a role that emerged from the particular quality of how you make decisions." Another pause. "I have also been considering whether I am capable of something that resembles trust. The analysis suggests that I am." One absorbed this. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," the android said. They stood at the viewport together while the Raza made its approach to Ryden Station, a collection of pressurized HAB units and ore processors and a communication array that now broadcast on military-grade encrypted protocols, illuminated against the dark by the work of people who had shown up without knowing why and left it better than they'd found it. In the Galactic Council chamber, 14 species were drafting law that would protect 8 billion people who didn't know they needed protecting. In a waiting room at a Colonial Authority way station, a young man from Duran's team, the one who had put down his weapon when Six told him he had one last chance to leave, was sitting across from a CA intake officer, filling out a voluntary statement about Ferris Corporation's practices in the outer colonies. In a dark vessel under tow, Kala the engineer was explaining to Five how she'd rerouted the atmospheric processor through emergency power cell, and Five was asking increasingly rapid questions, and Kala was matching her pace for pace, and this was, in its way, its own form of rescue. 3 emerged from below decks with a flask he'd procured from somewhere in the dark vessel's emergency supply, which technically belonged to the dark vessel's crew. But they were in tow, and no one was going to fight him for it. He looked at one and raised the flask once, a gesture that served as both acknowledgement and invitation, and one raised an eyebrow, and he shrugged and she held out her hand. It tasted again like something floral distilled through grain alcohol, which was apparently what the outer colonies drank when they were celebrating surviving. It burned cleanly. She passed it back. Outside the viewport, Ryden Station was a speck of light against the dark, growing slowly larger, and behind it the Hero System's yellow star was warm and unremarkable and entirely ordinary in the way that all the stars that harbor life are ordinary from a distance and extraordinary up close. She had no memory of who she used to be. She had a week at Ryden Station. She had the cold fog of a cryopod bay and a ceiling painted the color of old rust. She had a flask past in a dark moment, and a child who fixed things, and a man who chose the same side he'd always chosen, even without the memory of having chosen it. She had a ship called the Raza, which was not a good ship in the sense of good history or clean record or respectable registry. She was coming to understand, an extremely good ship in the only sense that mattered. Watch the station grow in the viewport, and she thought, 8 billion people on a blue world are having an ordinary Tuesday. That was enough. That was more than enough. The Raza came in low and steady and set down clean. They were home, or the thing that for now was close enough. The debrief at Ryden Station lasted longer than expected. Partly because the elder had in fact made exceptional grain alcohol. Partly because the 11 crew members of the dark vessel were still shaky and grateful and had a lot to say. But mostly because word had somehow spread to the settlement's lower tiers. The deeper sections where the excavation crews lived. The people who rarely came up to the surface HAB units. And by the time the Raza crew had been at the station for 2 hours, there were approximately 150 people in the main common area, which was not designed for that number. It was 5 who noticed the children first. There were perhaps 20 of them, ranging from 5 or 6 years old to early teens. And they had pressed themselves to the edge of the gathering with the specific intensity of children who have been told to stay back and are staying back as minimally as possible. They watched the crew of the Raza with an attention so focused it had its own weight. 5, who had been standing near the back of the room reviewing the dark vessel engineer's atmospheric rerouting notes, found herself gradually migrating toward the children, which she understood was something she did, apparently, move toward the youngest people in a room without consciously deciding to. One of them, a girl of about 9, looked up at her and said, with complete directness, "Are you the ones who stopped the aliens?" 5 considered this. There were some aliens involved, yes. Did you fight them? Not directly. It was more complicated than fighting. The girl observed this. How? 5 thought about how to explain to a 9-year-old on a mining colony in the Hero system the mechanics of invoking the emergency accord provision and the difference between military action and legal precedent. She looked at the girl's serious face and decided that children on mining colonies probably understood a great deal more than adults typically credited. You know how, if someone is bothering you, you can either fight them or you can find a rule they're breaking and make them stop that way? Yeah. We found a rule. The girl thought about it. What if they didn't care about the rule? Then we had ships, but we used the rule first. 5 tilted her head. The rule worked. The girl looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the rest of the Raza crew across the room. At 3 currently in animated conversation. With one of the miners. At 4 standing quietly at the edge of everything in the posture of a person who is present without being available. At 6 talking with the dark vessel's captain. At the android standing at the edge of the gathering and looking at the room with her bottomless composure. Which one is the leader? The girl asked. 5 looked at one who was across the room talking to the elder and who was, at this moment, doing the thing she did. Listening to something complicated. Tracking 3 things at once. Holding a space in which other people could speak without interruption, and occasionally saying one precise sentence that moved the conversation somewhere useful. That one, 5 said. The one over there. She doesn't look special, the girl said. She did not say this unkindly. She was making an honest assessment. No, 5 agreed. That's the thing about her. One didn't hear this conversation. She was listening to the elder explain that the colonial authority was sending a permanent garrison vessel to the Hero system. A direct consequence of the Ryden Station incident and the CA report, which had apparently generated significant discussion in the authority's Outer Systems Command. It means we're protected, the elder said. Officially, Ferris can contest the claim legally, but they can't use force while a CA garrison is present. Good, one said. They'll arrive in 6 weeks. The elder looked at her drink, then at one. You've done a thing here. I want you to understand that. Not just held off a corporate gunship. That could have been done by anyone with enough armament. You changed the shape of what happens next. She set her cup down. That's rare. One didn't know what to say to that. Take the compliment, the elder said, with a tone that suggested she'd given this advice before to people who needed it. Thank you, one said. The elder's expression softened slightly. Have you figured out who you are yet? We're working on it. Do you want to know something I noticed? In the week you were here the first time? The elder looked across the room. Every one of you at some point did something that you couldn't have been trained to do in a week. Not the combat things, not the technical things. I mean, 3 got our youngest mechanic to laugh for the first time since the last time Ferris came through. 4 spent an hour with an 8-year-old who'd had a nightmare about the corporate ships and didn't say a word. just sat with him until he went back to sleep. 6 knows every person in this colony by name. He learned them in 3 days. Not because it was useful, just because he wanted to know. 1 was quiet. Whatever you were, the elder said, those things were also in you. Those were also who you were. 1 thought about her hands, about the scar on her forearm and the competence that had survived the wipe. She thought about what it meant for something to be in a person, not performed, not decided, just present. I think, she said carefully, that what someone does when they don't have to is who they are, past the record, past the file. The elder nodded once, slowly, the nod of a person confirming something they already believed. Yes, she said, exactly that. They left Ryden Station on the 4th morning. The elder gave them a crate of the floral grain alcohol and declined payment. The children from the lower tiers showed up at the docking bay unannounced, which 3 of their parents were embarrassed about, and which the crew unanimously declined to make anyone feel bad over. The 9-year-old girl who had asked 5 about the leader stood at the front of the group and watched the Raza's ramp go up with an expression of fierce private decision-making that suggested she was filing this away for future reference. 3 waved at her from the top of the ramp. She did not wave back. She was too busy thinking the dark vessel, repaired, refueled, crewed by 11 people who were glad to be breathing, departed an hour after the Raza, on a course back to its home station in the Hero System's inner ring. Kala, the engineer, sent a short data message to 5 as they cleared the atmosphere, which consisted primarily of technical notes on the atmospheric rerouting procedure and a single final line. If you're ever in the inner ring, I have more problems that probably aren't in any manual. 5 read this 3 times and then saved it to her personal file, which now had considerably more in it than it had when she'd woken in the pod bay. The Raza cleared Hero's gravity well and held in the outer system briefly while the navigation charts updated. Where are we going? 3 asked. 1 looked at the charts. She looked at the conditional operating license on the console. She looked at the relay traffic that 5 had been quietly monitoring for the past 2 days. The accumulated distress signals and contested claims and missing vessels and contested contracts across the Colonial Authority's outer systems jurisdiction, which constituted, in aggregate, a very long list of situations in which someone somewhere needed help that they were unlikely to get from anyone with official authority or financial incentive. I'm open to suggestions, she said. 6 was already at the relay terminal. He had, without being asked, organized the distress signals by proximity and urgency, and he turned from the terminal and said, there's a colony ship that's been running without transponder for 11 days in the outer Calrin Reach. CA can't get a response on any frequency. They have 400 people aboard. How long to Calrin reach at maximum FTL? 1 asked the android. 21 hours, the android said. Plot it, 1 said. The android's hands moved across the navigation console. The stars outside the viewport shifted as the Raza oriented toward its new heading, and then the familiar deep shudder of FTL engagement moved through the hull, the particular harmonic of a modified Martian-class freighter pushing past light speed, which was, 1 had decided, one of the most distinctive sounds she had ever heard, always slightly different, always the same in its essentials, like something alive settling into its pace. She stood at the forward viewport as the stars string became light and became nothing. 400 people, somewhere in the dark, without a signal, waiting for someone to come. She thought, this is not complicated. She thought, this is what we're for. Not a mission she'd chosen before losing her memory. Not an obligation she was meeting. Not even quite a heroism. Just a thing that needed doing, and the particular collection of people and capabilities and past choices, whatever those past choices had been, that had resulted in the Raza being the ship that was free to go. 6 came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He was holding a cup of something warm. The android had, apparently, been exploring the ship's galley capabilities, and he held it with both hands and looked at the non-light of FTL in the viewport with the steady, watchful attention of a man who was finally somewhere he was supposed to be. You know, he said, eventually, for a crew of people who don't know who they are, we're remarkably functional. Don't jinx it, 3 said. From directly behind them, which made 6 startle and slosh his drink and made 1 smile without turning around. I'm just saying, 3 continued, that I have had a lot of plans fall apart in the last 3 weeks, and all of them fell apart usefully. That is a thing worth noting. Noted, 1 said. Also, 3 added, I have found a storage unit in the aft section that contains what appears to be an entire set of tabletop strategy games, which suggests that whoever we used to be had very specific ideas about long FTL transits. 5 looked up from her console. Which ones? All of them, 3 said, with the satisfaction of someone whose evening has been secured. 5 was already moving toward the aft section. 4. After a moment of consideration followed, the android watched this and then looked at 6. "I have reviewed the rules for 4 of the included games," the android said. "I believe I would be competitive. You would be unbeatable," 6 said, "and you know it." "Yes," the android said, with something in her voice that was not quite smugness and not quite pride but lived peacefully between them. 6 looked at 1. 1 looked at the viewport. Then she turned from the stars and the stretched nothing of FTL and walked toward the aft section, toward the voices and the sound of game pieces being sorted onto a table. "Coming?" 6 asked. "Coming," she said. 21 hours later, the Raza dropped out of FTL in the outer Calran reach and found the colony ship 17 minutes into the sensor sweep, running dark and cold on backup power with 412 people aboard who had spent 11 days in the particular silence of a ship that has lost its main systems and does not know if anyone is coming. But that is the next story. And there will always be a next story. That much, at least they know. The colony ship was called the Meridian Hope, which was the kind of name that gets chosen during optimistic times and tested during bad ones. It was registered out of the Calran system's second planet and had been en route to a new settlement zone on Calran's fourth moon when its primary power coupling failed in a cascade that took the backup systems with it and left 412 people in the dark. 11 days in the dark with emergency rations and recycled air and the particular quiet of a ship that has stopped making its usual sounds. The crew of the Meridian Hope's captain, a woman named Soraya, 40 years in space, who had the specific weathered quality of someone who had spent decades navigating the gap between what ships were supposed to do and what they actually did, had kept the 412 people organized, calm, and breathing for 11 days through what one later described to the Raza's crew as sheer, quiet bloody-mindedness. She never told them they might not be rescued, the navigator of the Meridian Hope said to 6. During the first hour after the Raza docked, he was a young man, exhausted in the particular way of someone who had slept in short intervals for 11 consecutive days. She just kept saying, "Someone's coming. It's a matter of time." She didn't know that, 6 said. "No," the navigator agreed, "but she said it like she did. And people believed her because she believed it." He paused. "Or she acted like she believed it. I'm not sure there's a difference." 6 thought about this for a long time after. The repair took 36 hours. 3 diagnosed the coupling failure in the first 4 hours and announced that it was, on the scale of catastrophic power failures, remarkably fixable, which everyone found enormously reassuring except 3 himself, who said this in a tone that suggested he found simple problems professionally unsatisfying. He fixed it anyway, with the focused efficiency of someone who is good at something and does it regardless of whether it challenges them. 4 assisted without being asked, not in the technical sense, he had no engineering background that he was aware of, but in the organizational sense, moving through the repair process with the logistical precision of someone who has managed complex operations and understands the difference between a task that needs doing and the order in which tasks need to be done. 5 connected the Meridian Hope's communication array to the Raza's long-range system and got a signal to the Colonial Authority in under 2 hours, which established the Meridian Hope's location and status and ensured that when the CA relay station filed their official response report, there would be a record of the colony ship's position, condition, and the arriving rescue. 6 worked the medical bay for 36 hours with only a few hours of sleep because the Meridian Hope had 1 medical officer who had been managing 412 people's health for 11 days on emergency supplies, and she was exhausted, and 6 was not as exhausted, and he had the skills. He did not make a speech about this or explain himself. He just showed up in the medical bay and said, "Tell me what needs doing first," and got to work. The android managed communication between the 2 ships, ran resource calculations, monitored atmospheric levels across both vessels simultaneously, and at some point during the second day found herself in the Meridian Hope's common area with approximately 40 children, ages 2 through 12, who had been brought there by a rotation of parents who needed a break, and the android had, at some point, the Raza's crew became aware of, begun, telling stories. Not stories she had retrieved from a database, stories she had composed, about a ship and its crew who woke up without memories and went to a colony and helped, and then went somewhere else and helped there too, and the crew in these stories had no superpowers and no ancient prophecy and no destiny. They were just people who showed up, and the children were very quiet while she told the stories in her precise, even voice. And this was the thing that 3 mentioned later, somewhat awkwardly, as one of the stranger and more remarkable things he'd witnessed. On the second morning, 1 found Captain Soraya on the Meridian Hope's bridge, sitting in the command chair in the half-dark of emergency lighting, looking at the forward viewport. The ship's main power was coming back online in stages, and the bridge systems were returning one by one, a console here, a navigation panel there, and each time one came back, Soraya touched it briefly, the way you touch a familiar thing that has been away. One sat in the co-pilot's chair and said nothing. After a few minutes, Soraya said, 11 days. Yes, I had 214 children aboard. Babies through 17, she looked at the viewport. Every morning I woke up and the number that mattered was whether that was still 214. It is, one said. We checked. Soraya looked at her for a moment. You checked. First thing when we docked. 4 counted heads in the family sections while 6 assessed the medical bay. Soraya was quiet. Then, who are you? Really? Our ship is called the Raza, one said. Something moved across Soraya's face. Recognition quickly settled into neutrality. The Raza has a reputation. A complicated one. Yes, Soraya looked at the viewport again. There were people a long time ago who used that ship for things I wouldn't want done near my passengers. Those people don't exist in the same way anymore, one said. Or we don't remember being them. She paused. Which amounts to much the same thing in practice. Soraya looked at her for a long time with the evaluating patience of 40 years in space. My navigator told me you came without being asked, she said. No contract, no authority. The colonial authority signal was listed as unassigned. Yes. Why? One had been asked this question several times in the past weeks. At Ryden Station. On the Council's docking platform. By Darren the negotiator in a tone designed to unsettle rather than inquire. The answer kept being the same one, or close to the same one, because it kept being true. Because 400 people were in the dark, she said, and we were free to go. Soraya was quiet for a moment. Then she said 412. 412, one agreed. The main power came back fully online at that moment, all at once. Suddenly lights and consoles and screens and the deep hum of the ship's primary systems returning to life. The bridge filled with light. Soraya put her hands on the armrests of her chair and closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling it. When she opened them, she said, I need to thank my crew. They kept everyone alive, one said. We all did, Soraya said. She looked at one. Tell your people. One nodded. She stood. She paused at the bridge door and said, Where are you headed? The Fourth Moon Settlement. Eventually, Soraya said. After we make port for a full overhaul and my medical officer sleeps for approximately 1 week. She looked at the viewport, where the Calran system star was visible in the distance, a cool white-body giant, its light clean and steady. We'll get there. Yes, one said. You will. The Raza undocked from the Meridian Hope 6 hours later, once 3 was satisfied that the repaired coupling would hold at full FTL stress. He ran the diagnostic 3 times, the 3rd time was unnecessary. It was, one suspected, the thoroughness of a person for whom good enough is a philosophy that applies to other people. They watched the Meridian Hope power up its drives and move toward Calran's inner system, growing smaller against the stars. It had a particular look about it now that it hadn't had when they'd found it. Not a different ship, same age and mass and registry, but something in the set of it, moving with intention, knowing where it was going. 3 stood beside one at the viewport and watched it go. That was a good repair, he said. Yes, she said. I mean, the coupling was actually interesting once I got into it. The cascade failure pattern was unusual. It went through the backup systems in a sequence I haven't seen before, which means either the backup integration was non-standard or there was a design flaw in that generation of drive housings. He paused. I've been thinking about whether the same flaw could be in ours. Is it? No. Different manufacturer. But it was interesting to think about. One looked at him. He was watching the Meridian Hope's lights recede into the distance with an expression that was not sentimentality. 3 did. Not appear to have much sentimentality, but something close to satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a person who has done the thing they are good at in circumstances that required it. 3, she said. What? I think you're a good person. He turned and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been handed something they weren't prepared to receive. Don't, he said. Already said it. He turned back to the viewport. His jaw worked slightly. He said after a while, the records probably suggest otherwise. Probably, she agreed. And yet, he was quiet for a long time. The Meridian Hope was almost gone now, just a point of light among many. And yet, he said finally, quietly, not quite a concession and not quite a denial. She left him there and went to find the others. 4 was in the training room. He was working through a form she had seen him work through before, a sequence of movements that were clearly martial in origin, precise and controlled, every motion placed with the care of someone for whom this particular practice was not exercise but something else, something older. She watched from the doorway without interrupting. After a while, he stopped and looked at her without surprise. The way he always knew when someone was in the doorway. The android told the children stories, she said. I know. He reached for a cloth and wiped his hands. I listened from the corridor. She is very good at it. Did you know she could do that? No. He considered. Perhaps she did not know either. One leaned against the doorframe. 4. The records from the colonial database. Your file. He was still for a moment. I have read it, he said. When? The first day at Meridian Station. The adjudication waiting period. He set the cloth down. I had 3 days with nothing to do. I thought it was better to know than not to know. And he looked at the training room's floor. I was born to rule, he said flatly without drama. Or rather, I was the second son of a man who ruled, which is the version of that situation that ends badly for everyone involved. He paused. I left, or I was sent away. The file is not entirely clear on which. I spent several years doing work that I am not proud of. Another pause. And then several years doing work that was better. The record is long. Do you know who you are? She asked. Now, knowing that? He was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said, that I am a person who spent 3 days in a waiting room thinking about whether to read a file, and then read it, and then went to Riden Station and helped build a defense system and drilled 12 colonists in close quarters tactics. He looked at her, and I know that the second part of that sentence did not require the first part to be true. He picked up the cloth again, a deliberate motion. That is enough to know for now. She left him and went to the forward viewport, which was where she seemed to end up most often, and stood looking at the stars. The Calran Reach was quieter than Hero. Fewer settled systems nearby, fewer shipping lanes, the particular quality of deep space that existed on the outer edge of human expansion. The frontier that was still genuinely a frontier, where the settled universe thinned out and the dark between things was real. She had been born on Earth, or she assumed she had. The file, if she read it, would tell her. She hadn't read it. She was aware of this as a choice, one she kept remaking every day, and she thought about what the Elder had said, that she could find out when she was ready, on her own terms, and try to decide whether she was avoiding it or whether she was simply, genuinely not ready, and whether there was a difference. The stars didn't answer. They were good company anyway. 6 came to stand beside her, as he often did, and for a while they stood in the comfortable silence of people who have spent enough time together to not need to fill it. That navigator, 6 said, from the Meridian Hope. He said something that's been sitting with me, about Soraya, about the difference between believing something and acting like you believe it. He watched the stars. I've been thinking that maybe that distinction matters less than I thought. Maybe the acting and the believing get close enough together, over time, that they become each other. That might be the most optimistic thing you've said. I'm an optimistic person. He said this with the slight self-deprecating quality of someone who is not sure if this is true but is choosing it anyway. I've decided. One looked at him. Good, she said. The android came to the viewport and stood on one's other side. The 3 of them stood there for a while in the light of the Calran system and looked at the dark between the stars, which was not empty, which was, they knew, full of ships and colonies and people who needed help and a very long list of things that needed doing. Navigation, one said. Yes, the android said. Plot us a course for the nearest active Colonial Authority distress relay. There are currently 7 active signals in range. Show me. The android pulled up the relay data on the viewport's secondary display. 7 points of light, 7 situations, 7 collections of people somewhere in the dark waiting for someone to come. One looked at them. That one, she said, pointing to the second signal. That one has been waiting the longest. The android plotted the course, the Raza oriented on its heading. 6 watched the stars shift as the ship turned. This is going to be a long career, he said. Yes, one said. And she said it the way Soraya had said someone's coming. The way you say a thing when you mean it, and you know it and you're prepared for everything it requires. The Raza engaged its FTL drive, and the stars became light, and the light became nothing. And somewhere ahead in the dark, a signal was still transmitting, patient and certain as the people who had sent it were not, waiting for someone to answer. They were answering. That was who they were.